Hello everyone, this is Bentley, and today we're going to talk about frozen foods. So a while back I talked about all of the flake and pellet and granule type foods that I use in my house or have tried. I included some that I've tried and not necessarily liked all that much, but all the stuff that I use. I wanted to talk about frozen foods because I had a great comment, which we'll put that up on the screen here, of actually just hey, can you tell us what frozen foods you use? You've talked about all the dry food. What about frozen? And we know that I've talked about live food and how I think brine shrimp is the best and how vinegar eels are super easy for little fish. But frozen food is a great way to not culture live food yourself, but get very similar effects. And if you are culturing live food, especially with brine shrimp, you can make your own frozen food if you want to. Obviously, I'm not going to have many props in my hands, but I'll put stuff up on the screen because it's frozen food and I don't want it to start melting. It is winter, so my house is a little warmer than usual. And, sitting in my hands and stuff, it'll start to de-thaw, and we know I'm long-winded. So who knows how many takes it will take in order to get this right. Anyway, let's start with the most, what I think, obvious frozen food that a lot of people look at, which is bloodworms. Yes, I feed bloodworms. I tend to buy the big sheets of bloodworms rather than the cubes. I especially bought a bunch back when I had the zebra plecos, and I still have some because it just goes a long way. But it's really easy to break it up. You just literally have to pull it out for a minute to let it sort of start to cool or heat up a little bit, and then you can break it up and you can get it into small bits the size of cubes pretty easily, or take a hammer or whatever to it. Whatever your way is to break it apart. I just break it by hand. It's relatively easy, and it's a nice treat. I look at bloodworms as a treat and not a staple food, even for some of my fish that might appreciate a more carnivorous diet, like something like the zebra pleco. They're about the only ones where I would say regular bloodworms is kind of okay, but you still need something else in their diet. Rainbows, they're a great once every week or so type dietary little treat or boost. It's good protein, but that's about it. There's really nothing to bloodworms. So take that as you will. Nutritionally speaking, they're not the best, but most fish absolutely love them. Like my angels love them. My rainbows really love them. So I will feed them every once in a while just to give the fish kind of a treat. I don't look at it as something that is a heavy rotation in my feeding schedule. I look at it as one of those things where every couple of weeks, I'll give them something, especially if I'm looking to get some spawning behavior out of my fish. I will give them something like that the day before, and then often you'll see a little bit more coloring up and a little more rambunctiousness out of the boys the next day or that same day if I do it in the morning. So that's bloodworms. It's one of the most common foods out there. The next one would be baby brine shrimp. I know it's kind of obvious when you're hatching live brine, but keeping live baby brine shrimp in those little cubes, I think it's Hikari that makes the ones I do. They're just great. Brine shrimp is always good. Yes, you lose a little nutritional content when you go to frozen compared to live, because live for the first several hours, they still have, or not several hours, but about a day, basically. They still technically have a yolk sac to them, so there's a little extra nutritional content to them. Frozen baby brine, you're not going to have quite as much of that. Plus, when you freeze it, you lose some nutrition. Blah, blah, blah. We could go into all the science behind this. You guys don't care about that part. The basics is, it's still really, really good. And more importantly, it's an easy way to feed some of your fish as they get a little bit older, instead of hatching live, or maybe you don't want to do live brine. Buy frozen brine. You can make it last quite a while, especially if you have multiple tanks full of babies and you just kind of dip it in for a little bit, and then you just kind of transfer the cube between your tweezers, and you put a little bit in this tank, a little bit in that tank, and a little bit in the next tank, and you cover 3 tanks with 1 cube, because babies don't need a ton, but you can make a cube kind of go a long way. Or if you have really high density, a single cube can feed quite a lot of fish. Very, very nice, very, very simple. If you're talking baby fish, definitely make sure you're getting the baby brine shrimp cubes. Do not get the full-size brine shrimp cubes. They'll be way too large for your baby fish to eat. That being said, the spirulina brine, which is kind of a gut-loaded brine, those are really great for your adult fish. I will feed those every once in a while. I've tended to stay to some other stuff more recently, just because I found that some of my fish like the spirulina brine and some don't. So I tend to stick to stuff that they more universally love, but it's still really good, especially if you have some larger fish. Discus would be really great with that. Other semi-large, like full adult-sized epistos, where they have a bigger mouth. Some of your small, like shell dweller type cichlids and stuff like that, great for those guys, for the adults. Babies, not so much. You might be better off with just baby brine again there, and I personally always do baby brine in mine. The other food in that kind of realm would be Daphnia. I think Daphnia is a fantastic food, both live and frozen. So frozen Daphnia, I don't know, I probably feed that like once a week. It's one of the few foods that I do like to very regularly feed into a lot of my tanks. Some of my adults don't get frozen all that often. When they do, it's bloodworms is a treat, because they get a huge mix of like other like pellet, granule, and flake, and this and that and this and that, and some rapashi and all this stuff. So they don't see frozen as much, but a lot of my younger fish, my juvenile fish, they still get weekly frozen food pretty regularly. And Daphnia tends to be my favorite to feed. And again, this is just a matter, much like baby brine shrimp or brine shrimp in general, they're just very, very nutritious. They're very simple. They're a little bit larger, but they're small sized, so you can get they kind of clouded into the water and watch your fish chase all over eating them. And it's good activity. It's good nutrition. There's a good little bit of calcium in it because it is a microcrustacean. Lots of stuff like that. Like, just Daphnia is a super good food. I really can't speak highly enough about it. It's just amazing stuff. The next one in that realm, although smaller, would be Cyclops. Frozen Cyclops are, again, really, really great. A lot of the foods you'll notice are all like kind of microcrustaceans. They're things that you could culture live, but tend to be just easier to acquire frozen. I do Cyclops pretty regularly as well. If I'm not doing Daphnia the whole time, I will alternate Daphnia and Cyclops, or I'll put Cyclops in with smaller fish, like the Guppy Mansion will get Cyclops, and Daphnia would go into something like the 75 long behind me, where there's a bunch of juvenile rainbow fish and, Corydoras and danger noodle and all that stuff, where they can eat those foods. The guppies, to make sure the babies can get stuff. Cyclops is really good with them. Same with baby brine shrimp, but Cyclops is great because they're also very tiny, good enough for live bearers, like right off the kick. Great food. There is the brand that's on screen is the brand I use. I get it from Aquarium Co-op typically. Sometimes I'll go to another local fish store that's just down the hill from me, and I'll buy frozen food from them just because they're super close, and my drive to Aquarium Co-op is a little bit longer if traffic's not super light. So there's some worry about, if I don't have a styrofoam container, about them thawing a little bit and then refreezing and blah. Science stuff about why frozen food loses its nutritional value. It doesn't matter that much. Usually I make do. Typically I only do that. Like, I'll go to the co-op almost all the time just because I love going to that fish store. I love seeing all my friends that work there, and I do consider them friends. But in the hot summer, I will go to like the place that's like 5 minutes down the hill and buy locally. Or I try to give them some support, like, once a month too. So if I haven't been in there in like a month or two, I'll go down there and I'll buy my frozen food when I need to re-up, just to give them a little love. They've been around for a long time. Got to give your local fish store some love, especially if you have multiple good ones in the area. So we got Cyclops, Daphnia, Bloodworms, brine in its various forms. That's really most of the frozen food that I tend to feed. I avoid things like tubifex. I don't keep any of the fish that would want frozen beef heart or any of that bigger stuff. There is some difference between buying it in the cube and buying it in the sheet. Where you can, I think buying it in the sheet, if you're going to feed regularly, is better because it's a lot cheaper. But if you get some kind of deal through your local fish store to buy just tons of cubes, because they know, like, hey, once a month that guy's going to come in and buy this many packs of cubes, do it that way. Like, find a discount where you can, because if your fish store knows you're always going to come in and buy a certain amount of it, they're gonna treat you right, because that's just the easy way to do things. Now, as far as making your own frozen food, this is interesting. So if you culture, usually, like, I would say Daphnia and baby brine shrimp are the two easiest to do this with. All you have to do is, when you rinse them out into your clean water, make sure it's dechlorinated water. Don't use like fresh tap water that has chlorine or chloramine in it. It needs to be clean dechlorinated water. Distilled water is actually best for doing this. So you'd siphon out all your brine, and you would put it in like a cheesecloth or a strainer, or whatever you're going to do to get the liquid through, but keep the brine in, and then rinse them really good with some dechlorinated water. And then you can pack them pretty tightly in a thin solution. So you just use a little bit more dechlorinated water to rinse them off into some kind of container of some form or what have you, so that you have as much brine as possible in a small amount of water. Then pour that into ice cube trays and freeze it. You can do the same thing with Daphnia. If you are culturing paramecium or scuds, like scuds is another cool live food that I really want to do. Even, I guess, in theory, green water, but I would just keep the green water live. That's smarter. This is a way to make your own frozen foods and have it around. So, like, if you go on vacation, you could just have somebody feeding your frozen baby brine shrimp, because it'll last several months in frozen form, rather than, like, having to go buy cubes or powdered foods or somebody not knowing. Master Breeder Dean has this really good idea where he'll have a tank marked, and he'll have a color dot and a number, and he'll tell you, oh, that means you do 2 of this type of cube of frozen food a day, and that's it. It's just super smart for when he's gone and somebody else needs to feed his fish. When like he had a vacation recently, or like I think Christmas he went away, he had somebody taking care of his fish for him. It was literally just like a color and number system, so you knew like, oh, red, these ones get a thing of bloodworms. 1 red is a thing of bloodworms, or 1 brown is 1 cube of baby brine shrimp. That's this package here that also has the brown dot on it. It's made it super simple. And I was sitting there, I was like, that's a really smart idea. So you could freeze your own, make your own frozen food, especially if you make larger batches. Maybe you got a really big hatchery, or you don't have to feed a lot of it, but you can easily make a lot. Make a lot and freeze it and keep it, in little frozen cubes. And you don't have to have like giant ice cubes. You can do just a thin layer, or get... what I would suggest, I'll put a link to Amazon here with a little silicone mold that gives you a cube that's about the same size as the frozen food that we get in packages. That way you just have it really dense. It's distilled water is what you want to keep it in. Make sure it's distilled. RO water, for those of you who do RO, that would also be fine. Or just some really, really super clean water that is dechlorinated and safe. You don't want to have a lot of like extra random stuff in there. Get it frozen, and then you just have easy cubes to feed your fish. You can feed them effectively live food whenever you want. It's pretty handy to go ahead and take your live foods, and when you have spares or extras or purposely make larger batches, go ahead and freeze it, especially near vacation time. So if you're going to be gone and you got a house sitter or a pet sitter, you can just be like, hey, you see this bag of cubes, or however you're going to store it, you just feed this tank 1 cube, this tank 2 cubes, the big tank 3 cubes, or whatever your system is, whatever is like, that's the right amount of food where it's safe and won't cause any ammonia spikes, and feed all the fish, right? Great little system for taking your frozen foods or your live foods and feeding them when you're gone. And you can of course feed them constantly. So if you do happen to have lots of live food, or you get close to a season where like, I keep all this live food outdoors, but once I get to winter, it's not going to do very well. You could harvest it in mass and make ice cubes of all of it, right? Have all this cubed frozen food ready to go. So throughout the winter, you have frozen food available for your fish. Just plop it in the tank. Done. It's almost the same as having gone out to your live food pond and harvested and fed. So just a couple ideas. Little talk about the frozen foods I feed. Little talk about some of the frozen foods I don't feed. There's also, maybe people might ask, like, oh, what about like mysis shrimp or some of the other stuff that tends to be more saltwater friendly? I really seriously stick to baby brine shrimp, Daphnia, and Cyclops. Those are my 3 big ones. And then bloodworms are super popular. I don't feed them very often. But if I had more carnivorous plecos again, I would be using bloodworms a little bit more and mixing them in with things like Daphnia and Rapashi in order to get a really good complex blend of nutrients for those fish. All right, guys. Well, there's a quick jump through all the frozen foods that I do, the frozen foods I don't do, and a way to take your own live foods and make your own frozen foods. So what I would love to know from you guys, down in the comments below, tell me what frozen foods you feed. Maybe you don't feed frozen food. Maybe you only do live, or you think that frozen food is too expensive. Which, by the way, let me say something about this. If you buy frozen food and you only feed like a cube a week, frozen food lasts a very, very long time. And that nutritional boost that you get from that good food, and it keeps a little bit of predatory instincts because it floats around a little bit more, is so good for your fish. So just one of those things to keep in mind. Frozen food doesn't have to be every day. It can be once a week. It could be kind of a treat type thing. If you have lots of tanks, maybe you do it a little less often. That's fine. But there's ways to make frozen food a little more economical for you. Buying like the big sheets instead of the cubes is also another way. But consider it. If you haven't tried frozen food, consider getting some. Now, if you're in an area where it's hard to get frozen food, you would have to ship it, and that becomes very expensive to get it packaged and shipped. I totally understand, but every once in a while, do like one big order and make it last a long time. That's also a great way to introduce a really, really great food into your fish's lives. Ooh, that was terrible. I am still recovering from being sick, and my lungs are just all sorts of messed. Anyway, felt that little crack in my voice. So let me know in the comments below what you feed, what you don't feed, what you'd like to feed, whatever that is when it comes to frozen food. Tell me down below, or maybe just like, hey, I didn't think about freezing my live food. That's a great tip. I'd also love to hear that down in the comments below. If you appreciated this video, if you like just kind of knowing the stuff that I use, the stuff that I guess endorse. Endorse is not the right word. It's just the stuff that I enjoy using or don't use, or why I would use X over Y. Hit the like. Help the magic YouTube algorithm. That helps the channel a ton, and I appreciate it. I really, really do. If you can't stand frozen food, you only use cobalt flake or something, like I only use Northfin flakes. Cool, awesome that you are that loyal to a single food. I can respect that too. I just like to I like to live by the theory that variety is the spice of life. So if you only live by one food, you can hit the thumbs down twice. I'll understand. It's okay. It's okay. But otherwise, the rest of you, just little tap. Just a little tap-roo on that like button. I'd really appreciate it. And maybe even subscribe if you're not a subscriber and you enjoy this kind of information. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. And stay awesome.